Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into a kitchen that doesn't quite smell like home. It's smoky, sure, but there's also something wild on the air. Not garlic, not onions. No, this scent is older. Earthy. Gamey. A touch metallic. You're in a medieval kitchen, deep in some northern manor, and your dinner tonight has prickles. You stand barefoot on cold stone, wrapped in wool, holding a cloth sack that occasionally squirms. Inside? A hedgehog. And no, this isn't a pet rescue. It's supper. The kitchen itself is a kind of organized chaos. Iron hooks dangle from beams, hams and herbs and small birds hang drying overhead. Ash drifts lazily from the fire pit, and someone is stirring something thick and brown in a copper pot nearby. No one blinks at the hedgehog. In fact, the cook reaches out a calloused hand and takes it from you with an approving grunt. Still warm, she mutters, already reaching for a bundle of thyme. This is a household that knows how to prepare the woods. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere unusual, or just somewhere cozy, drop your city and local time in the comments. I always love to see where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The hedgehog preparation is oddly ceremonial. First, it's wrapped in wet clay, carefully, tightly, so no air bubbles remain. Then it's placed into the glowing embers of the hearth, slowly baking until the outer shell hardens like pottery. When it's cracked open, the spines come away with it. Underneath lies pinkish meat, glistening with its own fat, smelling faintly of nutmeg and smoke. You wouldn't call it beautiful, but it's neat. Deliberate. Served with a sauce made of vinegar, wild onions, and marjoram, it's placed on a pewter plate and brought to the high table. Eating hedgehog wasn't just a peasant's act of desperation. In many noble households, especially during seasonal shortages, these small woodland creatures became symbols of culinary creativity. Hedgehog meat was considered warming and dry in the humoral system, which meant it needed to be balanced with moist sauces and cool herbs. You weren't just eating, you were rebalancing your entire body. Or so the medieval physician said. You take your first bite. The meat is tender, somewhere between pork and rabbit, with a faint wild tang. The seasoning helps. The clay cooking technique, borrowed from Roman traditions, ensures the juices stay locked in. It's strange, yes, but not unpleasant. Still, the idea of it may take longer to digest than the meal itself. But hedgehogs weren't the only surprises hiding in medieval woods. Squirrels were everywhere, especially in the autumn when they were fat from gorging on nuts. Their meat, high in oil and protein, was often used in stews or roasted over open fires. Some households even marinated them in vinegar to soften the flesh before cooking. In noble households, they might be presented with garnish, apple slices, cinnamon, or crushed almonds, to impress dinner guests. A skilled cook could remove the bones so delicately that the meat stayed intact like a tiny roast. Served on trenchers made of stale bread, they were both meal and spectacle. Dormice, those tiny, sleepy-eyed rodents, were a delicacy inherited from Roman kitchens. While they were rare in most of medieval Europe, some southern households still maintained gleraria, little terracotta jars with holes punched in them where dormice were kept and fattened. Fed on chestnuts and sweet herbs, they were roasted or boiled, sometimes stuffed with chopped liver and crushed pine nuts. Historians still argue whether this practice really survived into the late medieval period or if it was merely remembered fondly in texts that echoed older traditions. Regardless, the idea of eating a creature that might otherwise curl up in your sleeve and nap is oddly emblematic of medieval food culture. Everything had the potential to be food, if prepared with enough care. Badgers, too, found their way into pots and pies. Their meat was thick and oily, and it had a strong, musky flavor that not everyone appreciated. But when soaked in ale and slow-cooked with leeks and garlic, it mellowed into something rich and filling. Some cooks recommended pairing it with sour apples to cut through the fat. Others warned that it should only be eaten in winter, when the badger had fed clean upon roots. Eating a summer badger, according to some texts, might give you nightmares, or worse, nosebleeds. Medical science in the Middle Ages had its own peculiar logic. You glance around the kitchen again. On one table sits a pair of partridges. On another, someone is plucking a pheasant. But tucked in a corner, half hidden beneath a linen cloth, is a long wooden platter holding two neatly skinned animals, one squirrel, one hedgehog, each dressed with sage leaves and tiny early figs. A servant carefully adjusts their position so they face outward on the tray, eyes closed, paws curled inward. It's meant to suggest they are merely sleeping. And sometimes that was part of the allure, turning the wild into something civilized. A woodland creature transformed by heat, seasoning, and presentation into something worthy of candlelight and song. It was a quiet kind of triumph, a way of showing mastery over nature, not through conquest, but through cuisine. Then there's the medicinal folklore. Eating hedgehog, it was believed by some, could cure urinary problems, ease melancholy, and sharpen the senses. Others thought the roasted skin, powdered into a tea, helped with stomach worms. Some even claimed that hedgehog fat, applied warm, could soften hardened joints. None of this was ever verified, of course, but in a world without consistent science or reliable doctors, food and medicine often blurred together. One lesser-known fact, in some regions of Germany and Bohemia, recipes for hedgehog included nuts and dried cherries, an attempt to make the dish more festive. In France, there are records of hedgehog pâtés served at feasts for minor nobility, especially in provinces where boar and venison were scarce. The flavor was described as nutty, resinous, and faintly perfumed by the underbrush. A bit of marketing, perhaps, but it clearly worked. You begin to feel full, not just from food, but from the layers of meaning wrapped into every bite. The hedgehog isn't just dinner. It's a reminder of survival, status, knowledge, and ritual. And as the fire cracks a little louder, casting orange shadows on the stone wall, you wonder how many other creatures once walked into kitchens like this and left as folklore on a plate. Outside, the woods stretch into darkness. Somewhere out there, another hedgehog burrows beneath a pile of damp leaves, oblivious to the meal it almost became. You, meanwhile, settle back into the warmth, belly full, head heavy, and ready for the next strange dish history has to offer. You awaken to the gentle crackling of a fire and the distant sound of bells. It's Friday. And in the medieval world, that means fasting. No meat. No roasted game. No fat sausages curling on skewers. Instead, the kitchen hums with quiet activity, adjusting to the demands of religious rhythm. The scent is subtle, nothing rich or meaty, but there's something curious on the air. Something fatty, crisped, and smoky, with just a touch of sweetness. You sit up slowly, your cloak sliding from your shoulders, and peer into the hearth. That thing roasting on the spit doesn't quite look like a fish, but it doesn't quite not look like one either. It's wide, flat, almost paddle-shaped, and the skin is crisping at the edges. A servant leans in and turns it gently. "Beaver tail," she says. "Lenten fare." Your eyebrows rise, but no one here seems surprised. In fact, it's a delicacy. One of the quiet absurdities that fill the gaps between doctrine and dinner. In the strange alchemy of medieval theology, the beaver tail, despite being connected to a land mammal, has been deemed acceptable for fasting. Why? Because it's aquatic. Because it looks scaly. Because, well, sometimes, rules were interpreted with a touch of hunger. Fasting, in theory, was a solemn practice. A time for restraint. For humility. But in practice, it sparked some of the most inventive culinary maneuverings of the Middle Ages. The Church, faced with the dietary realities of its flock, allowed certain liberties. Aquatic mammals, particularly ones with fish-like features, were given a strange sort of pass. The beaver tail, thick with fat and covered in leathery skin, resembled a fish enough, at least to the hungry eye. You step closer to the hearth. The scent is richer now. There's something buttery in the air, even though there's no butter in the kitchen today. The cook bastes the tail with a glaze made of oil, vinegar, a dash of honey, and crushed herbs. Parsley, sage, and a little dried orange peel. She lifts a knife and gently scores the flesh, allowing the fat to bubble up and crisp the skin. You watch it blister and turn golden, and despite your better judgment, your stomach growls. The church's approval wasn't universal, of course. Historians still argue whether the beaver tail exemption was a widespread practice or more of a regional curiosity. Some abbeys accepted it without question. Others condemned it quietly. Still others pretended not to notice. And in some places, like eastern France and parts of the Low Countries, it became a small culinary tradition, a loophole turned luxury. The servant slices off a portion and places it on a trencher of barley bread. The tail is surprisingly tender. The texture falls somewhere between pork belly and eel. The skin is chewy but flavorful, infused with smoke and herbs. The inside is soft, almost gelatinous, rich with fat but not greasy. You take a slow bite. It's strange. Foreign. And yet oddly satisfying. A savory reward, dressed in the costume of piety. You glance around the kitchen. The rest of the animal is nowhere in sight. Only the tail has been prepared, because only the tail counts as fish. The rest of the beaver, with its fur and muscle and distinctly mammalian nature, is stored away for Saturday. The cook gives you a knowing look. Just the tail today, she says with a wink. Beavers were valuable animals in medieval Europe. Their fur was dense and water-resistant, perfect for cloaks and linings. But it was their glands, called castoreum, that made them sought after by apothecaries. The strong-smelling substance, secreted from sacs near the base of the tail, was believed to treat everything from fevers to hysteria. Mixed with wine, it became a remedy for stomach aches. Applied to the temples, it soothed headaches. In some texts, it's even mentioned as a love potion. The line between medicine and magic was, as always, very thin. Some even believed that castoreum, when burned, could ward off demons or purify sick rooms. In more obscure herbal manuscripts, powdered beaver tail appears as a treatment for melancholy, sprinkled in wine and taken before prayer. You begin to wonder whether any part of the animal escaped the reach of medieval imagination. You chew slowly, savoring the textures. There's a mild tang from the vinegar, a softness from the rendered fat. It's not what you expected for a fasting day, but then again, very little in the medieval world is. The laws of food were as much about appearances as they were about ingredients. If it swam, or looked like it might have swum, or lived in a river, it could be classified as fish. Otters were sometimes included. So were seals, though more rarely. Later, even capybaras, massive aquatic rodents from South America, would be added to the list, officially approved for Catholic fasting in the New World. The idea was simple. If your conscience was clean and the tail was wet, you could eat it. There's a small, peculiar detail you notice as you eat. The beaver tail has been scored with a crisscross pattern, almost like fish scales. Decorative, maybe. Or maybe just convenient, giving the illusion of aquatic origin. The cook says nothing about it, but you suspect it's intentional. Appearances mattered. Food wasn't just about sustenance. It was about symbolism. About convincing not just your stomach, but your soul. As you sit, warm and full, you hear the faint sound of the monastery bell. It tolls slowly, marking the 6th hour. The kitchen pauses. A brief moment of reflection. And then the rhythm picks back up again, kneading dough, chopping herbs, stoking the fire. Lent may be a season of abstinence, but no one here seems to be suffering. A boy enters carrying a jar of dried figs and sets them beside a bowl of almond flour. Tomorrow, the kitchen will prepare Lenten pastries. Sweetened with honey, stuffed with dates and spices, and bound with oil instead of butter. No eggs. No milk. But still soft, warm, fragrant. The ingenuity of medieval fasting never ceases to surprise. Denied one ingredient, they replaced it with 3. Forbidden of food, they redefined its nature. In one abbey record from Normandy, monks were reported to have eaten beaver tail soup every Friday through the spring thaw. In another from Bavaria, the tail was wrapped in dough and fried in poppy seed oil. In Eastern Europe, beaver meat was pickled, smoked, and served cold alongside preserved cherries and horseradish cream. And in the royal courts of Hungary, it appeared, bizarrely, as part of Lenten feasts alongside roasted carp and almond milk cheeses. These dishes weren't just workaround meals, they were works of art, each one a quiet theological negotiation served on ceramic plates. You lean back against the stone wall, your belly gently full. The tail rests on your plate, half-eaten. It glistens in the firelight, and you wonder about the animal it once belonged to. Somewhere, far upriver, beavers build their dams beneath moonlight, unaware of the theological debates they've inspired. Creatures of both land and water, they became, through culinary sleight of hand, part of a sacred calendar. And you, drifting slowly toward sleep, realize this: in the Middle Ages, hunger shaped theology, and theology shaped cuisine. A tail became a fish. A loophole became a tradition. And dinner, somehow, became a quiet negotiation between appetite and belief. You awaken not to silence, but to the sharp, insistent cawing of birds just outside the stone casement window. The light is pale, filtering through a wool curtain, and the hearth is still glowing from the night before. Somewhere in the kitchen, someone is already plucking feathers. You rub your eyes and sit up slowly, registering the faint, dusty scent of flour and the tang of berries on the air, but beneath it all, a metallic scent, unmistakable and strange, fresh blood. It's baking day, but not the kind you imagined. Because today, the pie is filled with birds. Not goose, not pheasant, those would be too obvious. No, this pie is far more theatrical, far more unsettling, and in its own strange way, more prestigious. It's a blackbird pie, and yes, that nursery rhyme wasn't entirely fictional. While the image of 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie might seem like whimsical folklore, the reality, though slightly different, was equally bizarre, and just as extravagant. You make your way into the kitchen, where the cook is kneeling over a low wooden table, her hands dusted with flour, sleeves rolled to the elbows. She's shaping a crust the size of a small wheel. The pie is enormous, more sculpture than food. The pastry walls are thick and ornately crimped. On a nearby tray lie several small birds, their bodies stiff, wings folded neatly, heads still attached. They're starlings, thrushes, and yes, blackbirds. Each one cleaned, seasoned, and ready to disappear beneath a lid of dough. In noble households, these kinds of pies weren't really about eating. They were about spectacle. They appeared at feasts and banquets to delight, to shock, to entertain. And sometimes, they didn't even contain dead birds. Instead, a hollow crust would be baked in advance, then filled just before serving with live birds, yes, living, fluttering birds. Who would erupt into the air when the crust was cut, creating a fluttering explosion of wings and feathers that sent guests gasping and laughing in delight. It was a dish meant not for flavor, but for theater. A medieval magic trick, executed with flour, feathers, and a little bit of cruelty. The one being prepared now is of the older, quieter kind. No surprise squawking at the dinner table. Just a slow-cooked dish made from dozens of small birds, stewed gently in spiced wine and their own juices, tucked inside a layered pastry shell, and baked until the crust is golden and crisp. The cook brushes the top with egg yolk, one of the few allowed indulgences today, and pinches the seams shut. You sit down quietly and watch her work. She moves efficiently, almost rhythmically, as if she's done this 100 times before, and likely has. These pies were once common in the great halls of England and France, particularly in winter, when the forests were quieter and small birds were easier to trap. Historians still debate whether the blackbirds in these pies were truly eaten, or whether they were discarded after their dramatic reveal. But there's no doubt they were caught in great numbers. Bird traps, fine mesh nets and collapsible cages, were standard tools in many noble estates. And it wasn't just blackbirds. Larks, sparrows, finches, and jackdaws all made appearances in medieval pies. Some were roasted first. Others were cooked inside the crust. Some were stuffed with herbs, onions, and even bits of sugared fruit. In one surviving 15th century recipe, small birds are layered with bacon and dates, then topped with a heavy saffron crust. The taste, by all accounts, was rich, salty, and just slightly sweet. You lean forward as the pie is carefully transferred to the oven. An arched stone structure with glowing coals pushed to one side. The heat inside is fierce, almost suffocating. The cook places the pie gently on the stone shelf, then closes the iron door. It will bake slowly, for over an hour, until the pastry is firm and the juices have soaked the lower crust. She wipes her hands and begins preparing a garnish: sprigs of parsley, carved radishes shaped like roses, and a line of tiny eggs, dyed blue with crushed woad. What's most surprising, perhaps, is that this isn't considered a main course. This is an entremet, a dish meant to be served between courses, a kind of edible interlude. Sometimes savory, sometimes sweet, entremets were often theatrical, designed to amaze rather than nourish. They could take the form of golden peacocks redressed in their feathers, jellied castles made of fish, or even pies with moving parts and mechanical sounds. Blackbird pie was part of that tradition. A fleeting, edible spectacle that blurred the line between feast and performance. You rise and wander toward the far table, where a boy is cleaning more birds, this time tiny robins and wrens, barely the size of your palm. Their bodies are so delicate, their bones almost translucent. He moves gently, plucking feathers with soft hands, humming quietly to himself. It's strangely intimate, and strangely normal. In this world, food isn't anonymous. You see it whole. You see its face. And yet, for all its rustic charm, there's a strange kind of opulence in it. These birds may have been small and common, but catching enough of them to fill a pie was no easy feat. It required time, effort, skill, and servants. In many ways, a blackbird pie was a show of wealth precisely because it was so inefficient. No boar's head, no haunch of venison could rival it in terms of sheer, absurd labor. One lesser-known tradition. At some banquets, blackbird pies were served with a separate dish of spiced wine, warmed with cinnamon and pepper, intended to be poured directly into the crust once it was opened. The result? A kind of bubbling stew of bird and broth, eaten with slices of crust and hard cheese on the side. It was rich, overpowering, and almost always served with dried fruits, figs, raisins, cherries, arranged in patterns beside the plate. You sit back down as the cook lifts the pie from the oven. It's golden. Beautiful, in its own way. She sets it on a wooden board and cuts a small vent into the top, releasing a breath of hot, wine-scented steam. The smell is intoxicating, spiced, savory, slightly sweet. She waits a moment, then slices through the crust. The filling has darkened, the birds nestled tightly, the juices thickened. It's hard to tell where one ends and the next begins. A slice is placed before you. You break the crust with your fingers and lift a piece to your mouth. The meat is rich and dense, faintly gamey, with a whisper of smoke and cloves. The pastry is soft on the bottom, flaky on the top. You chew slowly, feeling the heat rise in your chest. It's more than food. It's a memory. A performance. A riddle baked in dough. You finish your plate as the bell rings again, signaling the next course. But part of you wants to linger here, with the blackbirds and the steam and the quiet crunch of crust beneath your fingers. Because in this moment, you're not just a guest. You're part of the ritual. Part of the rhyme. And somewhere, in the stories that survive, 24 blackbirds still sing beneath a crust of golden pastry. You drift awake not to the scent of meat or firewood, but to something gentler, smoother, almost floral. The air is thick with steam, and every breath carries the faint sweetness of ground almonds and the heady perfume of crushed rose petals. You open your eyes slowly and realize you're not in the roasting kitchen this time. The space here is quieter, more refined. Copper pans glint along the walls. A girl in a linen apron stirs something pale and glossy in a wide basin, her hand moving in slow, practiced circles. No blood. No feathers. No crackling fires. This is the sauce room, the heart of the noble kitchen. And tonight, you're here to learn how to make gravy without meat. At the long central table sits a selection of bowls, one of crushed almonds, another of stale white bread crumbs, and a third of rosewater. Beside them, a ceramic jug labeled Vernage gives off a faint whiff of spiced white wine. You sit down beside them, and already your fingers feel sticky just from the moisture in the air. Someone hands you a wooden spoon, and you begin to stir, folding warm water into the almonds until the mixture becomes thick, creamy, and faintly oily. This is no ordinary gravy. This is almond milk sauce, the pride of medieval Lenten kitchens and aristocratic tables alike. It's easy to assume medieval food was all blood and bone, roasts, organs, tough bread, wild meat. But that's only half the story. In many noble households, sauces were the soul of the meal. They elevated bland porridge and softened tough meat. But more than that, they signaled elegance. And during fasting periods, when animal fats and stocks were forbidden, almonds became a miracle ingredient. Crushed, soaked, and strained, they produced a pale, silky liquid known as almond milk, not the boxed kind you find today, but the original medieval staple. Once you had almond milk, everything else followed. Gravies, puddings, stews, even custards, some sweet, some savory. You stir your bowl slowly, watching the cream thicken. A cook comes by and adds a pinch of salt, a dash of ginger, and finally a small vial of rosewater. Just a few drops, but instantly the room smells like a garden after rain, soft, strange, ancient. You inhale deeply, and the scent clings to your throat like memory. The sauce you're making will accompany a dish of boiled artichokes and fried parsley roots. No meat. No dairy. Just texture, fragrance, and richness. You wouldn't expect to feel full from a plate like that, but the almond gravy is surprisingly hearty. It coats everything it touches. Even bread dipped into it becomes something luxurious. You lift the spoon and taste a drop from the back, warm, creamy, a little floral, a little earthy. It lingers on the tongue like a whisper. One fringe detail you hadn't expected: in some regions, rosewater wasn't just for food, it was used to anoint the hands before eating. A ritual of perfumed cleanliness. In others, cooks added violet extract or cinnamon for depth. Some even stirred in dried lavender, especially for puddings served at the end of Lenten meals. Historians still argue whether these fragrant sauces were popular across Europe or mainly confined to wealthy courts in Italy and southern France. What's certain is that recipes survive, often with scribbled marginalia, notes like, serve hot, but not too hot, lest the scent escape, or only a thimble of rosewater, no more, no less. Precision mattered. You look up and see a row of pitchers, some holding almond milk thickened with rice flour, others mixed with sugar and crushed dates for desserts. One jug, labeled for fish, contains a tangy variant made with mustard seed and white wine. Almond milk wasn't just a substitute for cream, it was a whole category unto itself. In lean seasons, it became the backbone of the noble diet. Rich in calories, easy to digest, and, most importantly, acceptable under church law. You help ladle the sauce into a shallow serving bowl, where it will wait for the next course. Already, new mixtures are being prepared. A woman with sun-reddened hands is blending almond milk with ground poppy seeds for a grayish pudding. Another is shaving orange peel into a vat of almond custard, which will be baked inside hollowed pears and served with candied fennel. And here's something unexpected: this whole operation, this quiet ballet of mixing and measuring, isn't taking place over fire. Most of these sauces are made with gentle heat, or none at all. They rely on patience, not power. Almonds are soaked for hours. Rose petals are steeped for days. The sweetness comes not from sugar, but from time. You lean over a recipe book, its parchment pages softened with age. The ink is brown, the script slanted. One recipe reads: take thy almond milk and blend with white bread, then temper with rosewater and boil it light, until it cling to thy spoon as dew upon grass. There's something almost poetic in it, like cooking was an act of gentle divination. Across the table, someone is layering a dish of fried leeks with saffron almond gravy, each layer separated by crisp wafers of dried bread. It smells faintly of smoke and honey. She adds crushed black pepper on top and wraps the dish in a cloth to keep warm until serving. This will be the centerpiece of tonight's Lenten supper: no meat, no cheese, no butter, and yet it feels decadent. Everything in this kitchen is working to disguise denial as pleasure. You begin to realize something: almond milk wasn't a substitute in the way we think of it today. It wasn't second best. It was celebrated. It allowed cooks to experiment with texture and fragrance. It could be warmed or chilled, thickened or thinned. It paired with vegetables, fruits, even fish. In some monasteries, it was brewed into a thin soup and poured over boiled rice. In others, it was sweetened and frozen into a kind of icy custard, a distant ancestor of sorbet. In one forgotten text from Avignon, a noblewoman's Lenten menu survives in nearly perfect condition. It includes 12 sauces, 9 of them almond-based. One, meant to be served over roasted turnips, contained almond milk, cloves, white pepper, and crushed violets. Another was poured over baked apples, and included a pinch of salt and orange blossom water. These were not simple meals. These were sensory tapestries, delicate, fragrant, and slow. You sit back now, your hands sticky with ground almond and your head light from the scent of too many flowers. Someone offers you a small clay cup of rose almond drink, slightly sweet, chilled from the cellar. You sip it slowly, and it coats your throat like velvet. It tastes like candlelight. Like quiet. Like nothing in the world is in a hurry. Outside the sauce room, the world carries on. Someone is shouting for onions, another is plucking a fish, but here, everything is still. You watch steam rise from the basin. You smell honey and almonds and petals and pepper. And you think, maybe, this is what grace tastes like. Not grand. Not loud. Just warm. Soft. Steady. And as you close your eyes, almonds still on your tongue, rosewater in your nose, you wonder how something so humble, so utterly gentle, could hold up the entire weight of a season meant for silence. You don't wake to the scent of sweetness this time. No almond, no rose. The kitchen air is heavier now, thick with steam, iron, and a faint coppery tang of raw flesh. You blink your eyes open and feel the shift immediately. This is not the room of sauces or spectacle. This is the butcher's domain. And today, you're here for something even medieval cooks considered a little peculiar. The butcher lifts a tray with both hands, and on it, you see them, pink, smooth, glistening, and strangely delicate. 2 pig udders. Whole. Intact. Ready to be stuffed, boiled, and served as a delicacy. Across the room, resting on linen cloth, lies something even stranger, a cow's womb, pale and veined, rolled into a tight spiral like a scroll. It's been soaking in vinegar since dawn. You're told it softens the tissue, makes it pliable. Makes it edible. Supposedly. If your stomach turns a little, don't worry, you're not alone. Even in the Middle Ages, not everyone was eager to eat these parts. But for those who did, particularly among the nobility and urban wealthy, they were prized for their rarity, their richness, and the strange combination of indulgence and thrift they represented. Waste nothing. Impress everyone. And occasionally shock the guests just a little. You're handed a bowl of stuffing. It's a dense mix of breadcrumbs, pork fat, sage, raisins, garlic, and 2 beaten eggs to hold it together. You press it into the slit in the udder, gently at first, but the cook motions for firmer hands. The udder must be full, tightly packed, almost bulging, so that when it boils, it holds its shape. It's then tied off with twine, dropped into a pot of broth made from onion skins, old bones, and a dash of wine, and simmered for nearly 2 hours. You watch it sink beneath the surface. The pot trembles. The smell intensifies. This isn't just awful. It's theater. It's medicine. It's fertility ritual. In some medieval medical texts, pig udder was believed to strengthen women recovering from childbirth. Others thought it improved male virility. Eating reproductive organs, they reasoned, passed on their properties. Logic? Not much. But belief? Plenty. The cow's womb is handled with even more care. It's unrolled carefully, sliced into thin sheets, and marinated again in vinegar, salt, and a bit of saffron. Then it's dredged in flour, dipped in egg, and fried until golden. The result is served with a sauce made from onions, vinegar, and crushed prunes, sour, rich, and oddly fragrant. One bite, you're told, and you'll feel as if you've eaten something secret. You sit at the far end of the table, staring at the finished plate. It looks almost like pasta. Thin, curled ribbons stacked like leaves. You take a cautious bite. It's chewy, yes, but not unpleasant. The vinegar cuts the richness. The texture is somewhere between calamari and boiled mushroom. The sauce helps. Everything rides on the sauce. One cookbook from 14th century Italy, Libro della Cucina, lists pig udder alongside roast peacock and stuffed dormouse as dishes suitable for feasts. Another, from Catalonia, offers 5 variations: boiled, roasted, fried, steamed, and even cold with mint and citrus peel. Some versions included a second stuffing, cheese and egg yolks blended with saffron, tucked inside the boiled udder before it was sliced like a roulade. You're told that in parts of Central Europe, udder was smoked, then grilled over charcoal and served with juniper berries. In northern France, it was glazed in honey and served with bitter herbs. Each variation speaks to the same idea: take what others discard, and make it glorious. Historians still debate how widespread these dishes truly were. Some argue they were limited to feasting days, curiosity courses served between more palatable fare. Others suggest they were more routine, part of a broader culture of whole animal eating that defined medieval resourcefulness. What's clear is that recipes exist, and not just 1 or 2, but dozens, scattered across manuscripts from Sicily to Saxony. And not just in Europe. Some early Middle Eastern sources also mention udder and womb dishes, often flavored with cinnamon, cloves, and pomegranate syrup. These were not foods of shame. They were celebratory, grounding, and symbolically powerful. In weddings, they were sometimes served to promote fertility. In funerals, they marked the full use of the body, a return to the earth with nothing wasted. Across the kitchen, a young apprentice slices boiled udder into thick coins. He arranges them on a pewter platter, garnishing them with green almond slivers and tiny violets, edible, sweet, and entirely decorative. The plate is meant for a merchant's wife recovering from childbirth. You're told it's a sign of wealth and care. Not everyone can afford to give the good parts to the recovering mother. Next to you, someone drops a clean cloth into rosewater and begins wiping the carving knife. There's a reverence to it. As if this process, strange as it is, demands something sacred. You begin to understand, this isn't just food. It's a gesture. An act of devotion. Of resilience. And maybe it isn't so strange after all. In a world without refrigeration, without waste, without ease, What else would you do but use every part? What else would you do but season and soak and transform? You think of modern menus, where words like nose to tail carry a kind of chic daring. Here, it was survival. Or pride. Or both. Even the broth, what's left after the udder is removed, is saved. It's thickened with barley flour and mustard, then poured over cold meats the following day. Some say it strengthens the lungs. Others say it improves complexion. You don't know about either, but you sip a spoonful anyway. It's deeply savory, like the memory of something rich you can't quite name. The kitchen smells strange now, sweet and sour and iron and firewood. The sun has moved across the window. The light is low and golden. Someone hums. Someone laughs softly. A loaf of dark bread is sliced. And the udder coins are finally served, each bite surrounded by something soft, steamed cabbage, pickled carrot, dried fig. There is silence at the table. Not discomfort, but reverence. The same silence that falls after a prayer. You chew slowly, thoughtfully, and realize this: medieval people didn't fear the body. They honored it. With spice. With vinegar. With flame. The steam rises. The broth bubbles. The kitchen softens into the same tired rhythm it always finds after something bold has been made and served. There's a satisfaction in the air. A silence that follows good work. You sip warm vinegar wine from a cup and trace your finger along the pattern carved into the pewter rim. The food is strange. Yes. But it's also honest. It tells the truth about how people lived. About how they honored what they had, transformed what they feared, and tried, every single night, to make it beautiful. The light in the hall is dimmer now. Candles flicker in tall iron holders, and the scent that curls into your nostrils isn't rich or spicy, it's perfumed. But not with rosewater or almond. No, it's muskier, sharper, faintly smoky. And threaded through it all, unmistakably, is the smell of burnt feathers. Not by accident. You rise slowly, blanket slipping from your shoulders, and step toward the great feasting table, where something astonishing is being carried in. It's a bird. But not just any bird. It's tall, stretched long and regal, with a fan of resplendent blue-green tail feathers trailing dramatically from the serving platter to the floor. Its head is upturned, beak agape in silent song, and its breast is puffed out proudly. Its wings are intact, feathers gleaming. But its body, beneath the restored skin, is roasted. Carefully sewn back into its own plumage, it gleams under the torchlight. A peacock. Whole. Dressed. Impossibly beautiful. And, if we're being honest, impossibly tough. Because the real problem with peacock wasn't how to catch it. It wasn't how to dress it. It wasn't even how to serve it with maximum pageantry. The real problem was, no one really liked the taste. You stand there watching the servants place the bird in the center of the table, a spectacle of color and light. The nobleman hosting tonight's feast smiles and claps as if he's won a battle. And in a way, he has. Not against appetite, but against obscurity. This dish isn't here to feed anyone. It's here to dazzle. To whisper, without needing to say it aloud, I can afford to do this. And you can't. Peacocks weren't native to most of Europe. They had to be imported, either from the eastern Mediterranean or, later, raised in manor estates at great expense. They ate heartily, required warm shelter, and made terrible noises. But they were beautiful. Unnaturally so. Their feathers were prized for courtly fashion, their eggs considered lucky, and their presence at a banquet was the medieval equivalent of fireworks and silver fountains. And so, despite their stringy meat and unpleasant flavor, they kept being served. You make your way to the kitchens again, where the second peacock, this one less showy, is being prepared. The process is laborious. First, the bird is plucked, dressed, and roasted on a spit over open flame. The meat is basted with oil, garlic, and vinegar to soften the muscle, which even after hours of turning, resists tenderness. Once fully roasted, the skin, carefully removed before cooking, is stitched back over the bird, and the feathers, preserved and fanned, are reattached. Sometimes a small iron rod is inserted into the neck to keep the head upright. And sometimes, the beak is filled with incense. Or the feathers are brushed with saffron water to deepen their hue. Or the entire bird is gilded. Yes, actually painted with edible gold leaf. Because why not? You've already gone this far. One 15th century English banquet record describes a feast where a peacock was served, with its tail ablaze, thanks to a trick involving oil-dipped wicks hidden in the breast. Guests reportedly applauded. No one remembered how it tasted. You sit beside the cook as she scrapes a glaze made from egg yolks, breadcrumbs, and verjuice over the second bird. It smells sour, herbal, faintly medicinal. She shrugs. The sauce hides the truth, she says with a wry smile. And what is that truth? That peacock is tough. Almost leathery. Like overcooked turkey crossed with dry goose. The meat clings to the bone. The flavor is gamey, slightly bitter. Not inedible, but certainly not worth the spectacle. And yet, there's a record from the court of Burgundy listing it as a preferred dish at New Year's feasts, for the color, for the symbolism, and for the awe it inspired. Peacock was also seen as morally symbolic. In some Christian traditions, it represented immortality, the flesh was said not to rot quickly after death. In others, it was tied to pride, vanity, and resurrection. Serving it wasn't just a matter of wealth, it was layered with messages, half visible beneath the glitter. You're handed a slice now, the leg of the secondary bird, not the table centerpiece. You bite in. It's dry. Fibrous. The glaze helps, but only just. You find yourself chewing for a long time, and when you're done, the flavor lingers, not savory or satisfying, but faintly metallic. It's food designed to be looked at, not eaten. Across from you, a page is arranging the tail feathers of the centerpiece into a fan, brushing them with a tiny comb made from bone. The way he moves, you'd think it was a relic. And in some ways, it is. Peacocks appeared on coats of arms, on embroidered gowns, in romantic poetry. One noble knight vowed on a roasted peacock before heading to battle, a tradition known as the vow of the peacock. It was, perhaps, the most dramatic example of eating your feelings. A few guests take slices. Most do not. The bird is admired, commented on, photographed in memory, but barely consumed. And no one minds. That was always the plan. One fringe detail not often recorded, in a few southern households, the peacock was stuffed before roasting, not with bread or herbs, but with other birds. Smaller ones. Quail. Pigeons. A miniature aviary sealed inside the larger frame. A meat mosaic, constructed entirely for surprise. Some recipes even suggest surrounding the roasted bird with molded sugar sculptures, tiny trees, deer, castles, to turn the platter into a miniature landscape. There are even records of mechanical peacocks, puppet creatures powered by pulleys, wheeled in during the entremet courses of elite banquets. Their calls were mimicked by hidden boys trained to whistle from behind tapestries. And when they arrived, they didn't serve food. They served status. Historians still argue whether these extravagances were truly widespread or simply one-off events preserved by fawning scribes. But enough recipes survive to suggest it wasn't just a dream. It was theater, repeated. Later that evening, after the last candle gutters out and the guests retire to their chambers, the remnants of the peacock are taken back to the kitchen. The feathers are carefully removed, dried, and saved. They'll be used again, for hats, for fans, maybe even for another roast. The meat is packed away, and what isn't reused becomes broth, or perhaps food for the dogs. Nothing is wasted. Even the bones will be boiled, the fat rendered, the scraps turned into future meals for the less honored tables. You remain seated long after the bird is gone, tracing the rim of your plate, still faintly warm from the fire. You think about how so much of this world is constructed for appearances, for performance. And how even when the taste disappoints, the gesture endures. The peacock doesn't have to be delicious. It only has to be unforgettable. And it is. You wake this time to a different scent entirely. Heavier than broth, darker than bread, sharper than vinegar. It catches at the back of your throat as you breathe it in, slightly metallic, oddly sweet, unmistakably iron-rich. You're back in the kitchens, but now you're closer to the hearth than before. On a wide wooden counter rests a shallow ceramic bowl, dark red and steaming. You blink and realize what you're looking at: goose blood. Freshly collected. Still warm. Still stirring faintly from the heat of the bird. You sit up straighter and glance at the goose on the butcher's block. Plucked clean. Head gone. Chest neatly split. The cook stands beside it, rolling up her sleeves, preparing for what comes next. Because tonight's meal isn't just roast fowl or root stew. It's something stranger. Something thicker. You're making blood pancakes, dense, chewy, spiced, and pan-fried in lard. Followed by a sauce so dark it almost looks like ink, made by boiling the collected blood with wine, vinegar, ginger, and crushed dried cherries. To a modern mind, it might sound macabre. But in medieval kitchens, blood wasn't taboo, it was treasured. Not only was it full of nutrients and easy to preserve with salt or acid, but it also served as one of the most versatile thickeners in the cook's arsenal. Before corn starch, before flour-based roux, before emulsified creams, there was blood, primal, potent, and unexpectedly elegant when handled with skill. You reach for a ladle and gently stir the bowl. It's already cooling, beginning to congeal at the edges. The key, the cook tells you, is to work quickly. Once it thickens, it becomes impossible to pour. So you mix in a handful of breadcrumbs, a pinch of nutmeg, some finely grated onion, and a bit of ground coriander. Then comes the flour, barley, not wheat, and an egg to bind it all. The batter becomes thick and dark, like chocolate mousse left in the sun too long. You spoon a dollop into a hot pan. It sizzles immediately, spreading just slightly before setting into shape. The outer edge crisps, but the center stays tender, almost custardy. You flip it. Golden flecks appear along the brown surface. It smells earthy, warm, and faintly sweet, thanks to the spices. Once cooked, it slid onto a pewter plate and kept warm beneath a damp cloth. One by one, more are made. A stack forms. In the corner, another pot is beginning to bubble. The blood sauce. Into it goes red wine, a few dried prunes, a splash of vinegar, and a chunk of stale rye bread to give it body. It simmers until thick and glossy. A spoon dipped in and lifted trails a slow crimson ribbon that clings to the metal. You're told it will be served with roast goose, or over a root vegetable hash if meat is scarce. Blood had many roles in the medieval kitchen. It wasn't just for sausage or stews. It was binding agent, flavor enhancer, sometimes even decoration. In one 14th century English feast, black pudding slices were arranged in concentric circles and topped with crushed lavender and sugared rose petals. In certain Slavic traditions, blood was stirred into barley porridge during winter fasts, both to darken its color and enrich its taste. Historians still debate whether these customs were culinary invention or inherited ritual. What's clear is that blood carried meaning, symbolic and literal. You take a bite of the pancake. It's dense. Warming. The texture is like a cross between a crumpet and a sausage patty. The taste? Subtle. Not metallic, surprisingly, but savory and spiced. You dip a corner into the warm sauce, and it changes. Richer. Rounder. There's a hint of fruit in the aftertaste, prunes or cherries, and just enough vinegar to balance it. It doesn't feel grotesque. It feels ancient. One cook nearby adds a dollop of horseradish to the plate. Sharp, white, eye-watering. Another prepares a garnish of chopped parsley and pickled red currants. They take this seriously. You watch a younger apprentice bring out a platter of sliced apples fried in goose fat to serve alongside the pancakes. The combination is beautiful in its contrast, sweet, acidic, fatty, and grounding. And perhaps that's the point. Blood wasn't used just because it was there. It was used because it created balance. Heat and depth in one ingredient. Strength and smoothness in a single pour. It could make the lean rich, and the plain exciting. In Parisian markets, preserved goose blood was sold in clay pots, mixed with vinegar and sealed with wax. In German towns, butchers advertised fresh blood alongside sausage and liver. In some alpine monasteries, blood pancakes were served with honey and mulled wine for fasting monks who still needed energy to labor in cold stone halls. And in the Polish court of the 15th century, a dish known as czernina. A soup of duck blood, dried pears, and fermented rye, was served to guests as a sign of grief or rejection. Food, once again, carried meaning far beyond the plate. You watch the cook slice one pancake into quarters and lay them out like petals on a ceramic dish. She drizzles them with the glossy sauce, adds a spoonful of stewed onions to the center, and tops it with 3 toasted hazelnuts. It looks more like an entree at a fine restaurant than something scraped from the dregs of a butcher's bowl. And in this kitchen, that's the greatest compliment of all. You wonder if the guests will eat it all. Some might. Some will taste it politely, then turn to more familiar comforts, cheese, bread, fruit. But others, you suspect, will return for a second helping. And not because they're hungry. Because it lingers. Because something about it feels whole. You dip your finger into the remaining sauce and touch it lightly to your tongue. Warm, silken, and slightly sour. You suddenly think of blood not just as nourishment, but as connection. In some rural regions, when a family slaughtered a goose for winter, they would keep the blood and give it to elderly neighbors or women in recovery. It was thought to bring strength. To warm the chest, they said. Even in grief, even in scarcity, it was passed along. Quiet generosity in a dark red bowl. And here, in this kitchen, it becomes something more. You watch the ladle rise, pour, return to the pot. The cycle repeats. Every drop measured. Every trace used. It is the opposite of waste. It is ritual. Economy. Grace. The kitchen is quieter now. The pancakes are done. The sauce has been strained and poured into a silver boat. You sit back, exhale, and feel the heaviness of the air. There's something grounding about it. The warmth of the fire. The quiet pride in the cook's eyes. The gleam of sauce catching the candlelight like lacquered wine. And you realize, perhaps for the first time, that in a world without waste, blood wasn't horror. It was respect. For the animal. For the moment. For the body that fed the body. These pancakes weren't born from violence. They were born from reverence. And now, as the plate is carried off toward the great hall, you're left not with hunger or revulsion, but quiet awe. Because tonight, the most beautiful dish on the table came from what most would throw away. You wake to the sound of rain, not the harsh kind, but a soft, steady patter, like fingertips drumming across a slate roof. The fire in the hearth has burned low, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. The air is cool, and for once, it doesn't smell of meat or spice or smoke. Instead, it smells damp. Green. A little sour, like leaves left too long in water. And underneath it all is something else, the unmistakable aroma of earth. You pull on your wool cloak and follow the sound of voices down a narrow back stairway. Outside, a group of foragers are returning, hands muddy, baskets full, cloaks soaked. They bring in bundles of wet moss, bulging mushrooms the size of small loaves, tangled vines with bulbous roots still clinging, and something that looks suspiciously like lichen scraped from tree bark. A woman drops a dripping bundle onto the work table with a sigh and says, "The forest fed us again." Today's menu is simple. There's no poultry, no pie, no organ meat or roast. Just marsh greens, wild fungi, and boiled water thickened with what the earth gave up willingly. If yesterday's kitchen was bold, full of blood and fire, today's is quieter, slower, more patient. It's the kind of cooking you do when the larder is low and the weather keeps you near home. The kind of food that demands you look at weeds with curiosity and mushrooms with trust. You're handed a knife and a pile of greens, dock leaves, nettles, something that might be chickweed. You trim the stems, rinse them in a pot of cold water, and blanch them in salted broth until they wilt into a dark, glossy heap. Beside you, someone slices mushrooms into thin fans, brown, soft, spongy. The cook picks one up, sniffs it, and nods. "Safe," she says. "Smells like pepper and stone." Mushroom knowledge is ancient. In medieval Europe, some fungi were prized delicacies: chanterelles, morels, boletus. Others were feared, suspected of madness or worse. Recipes rarely named them precisely. Instead, they used terms like earth fruit, forest tongue, or wooden ear. Identification was done by smell, touch, and season. Sometimes, a silver spoon was dipped into a pot to test for poison. If it darkened, the dish was abandoned. Whether it actually worked remains uncertain. But the gesture spoke volumes. Today's mushrooms are destined for a soup, mushroom pottage, it's called. Sliced fine, fried lightly in oil or goose fat, then boiled with leeks, parsley, and a touch of barley to thicken. A splash of vinegar sharpens it. A spoonful of almond milk softens it. The result is thick, dark, and savory in a way that's hard to explain. Not meaty. Not vegetal. Something in between. A middle flavor. A middle texture. Something gray and warming. The lichen is less familiar. It's scraped from the bark of old trees, soaked in vinegar to loosen the bitterness, then chopped and fried with onions. It won't be the centerpiece of any feast, but it will fill the corners of a plate, mixed into warm oats or spooned over toasted bread. Some believe it aids digestion. Others think it keeps the skin clear in winter. Historians still argue whether it was survival food or quiet luxury, something eaten because it was there, or because it was understood. You try a bite of the pottage. It's thick enough to hold its shape on a spoon. Earthy, yes, but also sweet, with the faint tang of leek and the bite of pepper. You chew slowly, appreciating the texture, silky from the mushrooms, grainy from the barley, aromatic from the parsley root. Nearby, someone is drying moss by the hearth. It will be crumbled and stored for later, used to flavor ale or line the bottom of baking pans. Even the tough stalks of last year's fennel are being trimmed, soaked, and added to the pot. Every scrap matters. Every leaf is useful. You remember now that these kinds of meals often appeared during Lent, during lean winters, or on days when the game failed to arrive. But instead of scarcity, what you taste is depth. This is the kind of meal that leans in close. It asks nothing of your appetite except patience. A monk's journal, preserved in a Bavarian monastery, includes a note about a soup made entirely from boiled nettles, thinned with rainwater, and flavored with old beer. It warms the chest, he writes, and loosens the tightness in the hands. Whether from arthritis or prayer, it's hard to say. Another entry, from a noblewoman in Gascony, speaks fondly of early spring mushrooms fried with breadcrumbs and egg, served beneath poached pears. Humble food, she calls it. But more honest than goose. You glance at the table again. Someone is shaving curls from a block of aged sheep's cheese, and another is slicing preserved apples soaked in mead. The cheese will be crumbled into the remaining soup, a final touch of fat and tang. The apples will be served warm, their sweetness meant to counter the bitter edge of the forest greens. This layering, of textures, temperatures, and times of year, is something medieval cooks understood intuitively. The land never gives all at once. It gives in waves. And those who listened closely could taste the memory of spring in a winter root, or the last breath of autumn in a dried fig. Even here, in a dish made from moss and lichen, there is seasonality. The lichen clings more bitterly in late winter. Mushrooms turn leathery if harvested after the first frost. Marsh greens change texture as the days lengthen. It wasn't enough to know what was edible, you had to know when it was most alive. A small girl enters the kitchen with muddy feet and something cupped in her hands, 2 perfect morels, plucked from beneath a willow stump. The cook beams, dries them gently with linen, and sets them aside. They won't be eaten today. They'll be dried on a string and saved for someone who needs cheering, perhaps an old widow, or a scribe fallen ill. You think of modern food as private, plated, personalized. But here, in this moss-scented kitchen, food is a communal instinct, a kind of collective patience. Everyone gathers, shares, trades, contributes. A wild onion from the marsh is swapped for 2 eggs. A pouch of barley is returned later with a thank you bread. And no one writes it down. No one needs to. The body remembers who fed it. You take one last spoonful of the mushroom pottage, now cooler, now thicker. The barley has softened completely. The greens taste like mist and memory. And you feel, more than full, you feel kept. You feel known. The rain still falls outside, steady now. The windows mist. A few foragers near the door shake out their cloaks and hang them to dry. The baskets are nearly empty again. Tomorrow, they'll return to the forest to find more. Or maybe not. Maybe they'll wait, listen to the trees, feel the ground. This kind of eating doesn't chase. It follows. And you? You'll sit here a little longer, hands around a bowl of something brown and humble and warm, and let the quiet of this food settle behind your eyes. Because sometimes, what grows slow and low and hidden is what feeds you best. You find yourself once again in the warmth of a medieval kitchen, but this one doesn't smell like damp moss or forest birds. It smells richer. Denser. There's a perfume in the air, clove, vinegar, sweet wine, and something darker beneath it all. It's fish, yes, but not quite. Something softer. Stranger. The cooks bustle around a long wooden table, and in the center lies a creature that looks more like a mythical beast than a meal, slippery, boneless, jawless, with a mouth like a sucking disc and skin like wet velvet. A lamprey. You've probably never tasted lamprey. And if you're lucky, or squeamish, you may never have to. But here, in this royal kitchen, lamprey is the prize catch, the centerpiece of a feast, and the fish of kings. Not because it's beautiful. Not because it's easy to cook. But because it's rare, stubborn, and deeply symbolic. You don't just serve a lamprey. You tame it. The creature is still moving. Just slightly. Someone mutters a prayer as they slip a knife behind the gill. There's no blood, only a clear ooze. The flesh underneath is pale, firm, almost gelatinous. The cook lifts it gently into a large pewter pan, already waiting with a mixture of red wine, leeks, ginger, vinegar, and crushed raisins. This will simmer slowly, until the meat darkens and the sauce thickens like syrup. Across Europe, especially in England and France, lampreys were considered royal fare. Henry I of England, legend says, died after eating a surfeit of lampreys. Whether he was poisoned, overindulged, or just unlucky, historians still argue. But the association between monarchy and lamprey stuck. To eat it was to echo kingship. To serve it correctly was to signal power, refinement, and culinary bravery. You're handed a small bowl of lamprey stew. It smells like mulled wine and the sea. You hesitate. The first bite is odd, smooth, chewy, a little metallic. But the sauce carries it. Sharp from vinegar, sweet from fruit, warm from spice. You close your eyes. You taste history. The cooking of lamprey was a ceremony unto itself. First, the slime had to be removed, sometimes with ash, sometimes with brine. Then, the lamprey was often strangled instead of gutted, to preserve the flavor. This method, as barbaric as it sounds, was believed to keep the flesh whole and clean. The internal organs were rarely eaten. Instead, cooks simmered the entire body in wine, sometimes wrapping it in pastry, sometimes slicing it into medallions like a sea sausage. The texture never quite resembled fish. It was more like soft muscle, somewhere between eel and foie gras. The most famous preparation was lamprey à la royale. This dish involved hours of slow cooking, reduction of sauces, layering of ingredients. Spices were essential: cinnamon, long pepper, nutmeg. These weren't used subtly. They announced wealth, taste, and access to distant trade routes. In medieval feasts, lamprey wasn't just served, it was performed. One French banquet account mentions lampreys dressed with candied lemon and a crown of bay leaves, set about with gold leaf. Another recipe from 14th century England called for the sauce to be thickened with blood and bread, then poured back over the fish and reboiled for strength. To modern ears, it sounds dense, intense, even alarming. But in a world without refrigeration, without clean oceans, where hunger lurked year-round, this kind of richness was a declaration of victory over deprivation. You look around this bustling kitchen. Two boys are pounding spices in a mortar. A woman is folding strips of lamprey into a pastry coffin. Someone else ladles off fat from a simmering pot and adds honey to mellow the acidity. The lamprey itself begins to break down, its skin wrinkling like silk, its body softening into submission. No one here finds this strange. They speak of lamprey like you might speak of truffles. It is not a joke. It is a delicacy. And in some parts of medieval Europe, it was even believed that lampreys had medical properties. Some texts suggested the meat improved circulation or soothed aching joints. Others warned against eating them in summer, when the flesh became overheated and might provoke fevers or dreams. A few odd herbal guides claimed lampreys should never be eaten by children or pregnant women, lest the blood become heavy. Whether any of this was true didn't matter. The mystery added to the meal. You ask whether lampreys were always this grand. The cook chuckles. Not always. The peasants roast them on sticks. No sauce. Just salt and fire. You imagine a smoky beach, a line of workers crouched by the river, holding their skewers like candles. That version of the lamprey is more practical, less adorned, but just as ancient. Not royal, perhaps, but still revered. Some monasteries, where meat was forbidden during fasts, made special allowance for lampreys. Technically, they were fish, but their anatomy was strange enough to spark debate. Their lack of bones, lack of scales, and unsettling mouth placed them in a gray zone. Some called them sea serpents. Others declared them acceptable for Lent as long as they were cooked without indulgent sauces. One Benedictine record from 1296 notes the delivery of 20 live lampreys, to be consumed plain, without wickedness. Historians still dispute whether that meant without spices, or without joy. You're told that lampreys could live in barrels for weeks if kept cool. They were often transported alive to noble households, where cooks would stun them with vinegar fumes or submerge them in wine to lull them. A soft death for a soft fish. You watch as another tray arrives, lamprey baked in a thick black crust of rye and ash, split lengthwise to reveal dark, glistening flesh. The inside is flecked with threads of saffron and dots of currant. This isn't just sustenance. It's theater. The dish is carried to a lord's table with song. The lamprey is announced by name. You wonder what it must have felt like, to eat this creature knowing that kings did the same. To taste something so old, so difficult, so strange, and call it luxury. Maybe that was the whole point, to find glory in the grotesque, elegance in the eel-shaped. And still, the lamprey remains elusive. Even today, they are hard to catch, hard to keep, hard to cook. Some modern chefs have tried to recreate medieval recipes using river eel or squid as substitutes. But the real thing remains, untranslatable. Outside, the river murmurs. The moon is low, casting a silver ribbon across the black water. Somewhere beneath the surface, lampreys still slither, blind and ancient, drawn upstream by instincts older than history. They are not beautiful. They are not easy. But they endure. And you? You've eaten one now, at least in story, and that makes you part of a long, strange, royal tradition. You've tasted what the kings once craved. And whether you loved it or hated it, you'll never forget how it felt to lift that trembling piece of sea serpent to your lips. This, you realize, is what makes history feel real. Not battles. Not dates. But the strange, smoky sweetness of a dish you never expected to like. You wake to the sound of river water lapping gently against stone. It's still dark outside, though the kitchen has begun to stir. This time, you're not in a castle or manor. You're in a simple riverside tavern, wooden floors, low ceilings, a hearth that still smolders from the night before. And on the worn wooden table beside you, glistening in the faint amber light, is a ceramic basin filled with something, shimmering. Translucent. Jiggling. A mound of pale, gelatinous coils. Eels. Jellied eels, to be precise. They don't look like food, at least not yet. Each one is curled tightly like a sleepy question mark, pale gray, their skin smooth and speckled, their bodies suspended in a cold, shimmering jelly made from their own reduced bones and flesh. And this, you're told, is breakfast. Jellied eels are not a medieval joke. They were a reality, especially in the Thames region, where eels were not just common but essential. In the late Middle Ages and well into the early modern period, eels were a vital source of protein for Londoners. River eel populations were so abundant that traps could be lowered at night and pulled up in the morning teeming with writhing catches. They were cheap, plentiful, and, most importantly, they could be preserved without salt. Just boil them long enough, reduce the liquid, cool it, and let nature take care of the rest. Gelatin forms naturally from eel collagen. No magic. Just biology. You pick up a wooden spoon and ease it into the jelly. It wobbles gently, parting around the pale meat. You scoop a curl onto a trencher of cold bread. The jelly glistens like glass. You take a breath, and bite. The eel is tender, not fishy. The jelly is savory and slightly tangy, thanks to the vinegar it was cooked with. There's a hint of mace, maybe a pinch of white pepper. You chew slowly. It's not unpleasant. In fact, it's oddly clean. Refreshing, even. The kind of dish that demands very little but offers a lot. In medieval England, eel wasn't a delicacy, it was a staple. Rents were paid in eels. Taxes levied in barrels of them. In some years, monasteries recorded tens of thousands of eels delivered as tithe. They swam upstream each year in astonishing numbers, and fishermen built elaborate weirs to catch them, shaping the river into long wooden fences that funneled the fish into traps. Some weirs could collect hundreds in a single tide. The popularity of eel wasn't just practical, it was also religious. During Lent, when meat was forbidden, eel was a permitted exception. It had no legs, no lungs, and no fur, therefore, it was a fish. Even though, biologically speaking, it's a little more complicated than that. Historians still debate the classification. Medieval scholars, lacking microscopes and taxonomies, often lumped eels in with serpents, sea dragons, and other slippery things. One monk wrote that, the eel has no bones, and yet moves as though it does, for it is filled with heavenly fluid. Another described it as, a fish that swims by sin. Sinful or not, people ate it. Constantly. There were fried eels, stewed eels, pickled eels, roasted eels on skewers, and, of course, eels turned to jelly. Recipes vary, some add wine and mustard seed, others bay leaf and allspice. But the base remains the same: clean the eel, cut it into chunks, boil it with vinegar and aromatics, and let it set. The jelly preserves it. No fancy jars. No salting. No drying. Just time and cold air. You glance around the tavern. A young girl is stirring a pot of oat porridge nearby, while her father sharpens a knife and prepares more eels for cooking. On the wall hangs a string of dried ones, thin, leathery, curled like old ropes. These are for soup. In the corner, a monk sits hunched over a small wooden book, spooning jelly from a bowl while murmuring something about St. Dunstan. Even the clergy, it seems, enjoyed a slippery breakfast. But jellied eels weren't just for peasants. Royal records show eel pies served at coronation feasts. Henry VIII was gifted a silver eel trap by a northern lord, an ornate, ridiculous object, but a symbol of loyalty all the same. In one household manual, a recipe for eel pudding calls for minced eel mixed with raisins, breadcrumbs, and saffron, baked inside a crust and served with verjuice. That same page warns not to eat eel if your humors are too moist, unless balanced with dry herbs like sage or hyssop. Because yes, humoral theory, as always, found its way into the recipe. And then there are the myths. Some believe that eels were born spontaneously from mud. Not hatched, not born, just summoned from the earth when the time was right. Others thought they grew from horsehair left in riverbeds. Eel lines, they were called, long strands of discarded mane tied to sticks and submerged in muddy water. When eels appeared nearby, it was said the hare had birthed them. This might sound absurd, but even into the 17th century, natural philosophers struggled to understand where eels came from. Their reproductive cycle was a mystery. No one had ever seen an eel egg. Historians still debate when this changed. Some say not until the 19th century. For centuries, eels simply were. You take another bite. The jelly has warmed slightly. The texture is now more like custard. The flavor remains calm, humble, steady. It doesn't excite, but it doesn't repel either. It lingers gently, like an echo of river water and old wood. In some towns, eel fairs were held during harvest season. Fishermen brought barrels of the creatures, still alive, slithering over each other in damp straw. Children would compete to see who could hold one the longest. The prize? A boiled one on a stick, served with pepper and sour ale. You imagine a medieval child, cheeks pink with cold, holding an eel like a soft rope, then biting into it like a sausage. No ketchup. No napkin. Just salt, smoke, and grin. Not everyone loved eels, of course. Some poets mocked them. One 15th century satire refers to them as serpents of the pan. Others warned against eating too many, claiming it caused dreams, faintness, or wandering thoughts. One apothecary warned that eel jelly clouded the eye and loosened the belly. You note that down silently. Still, the reputation endured. In the 13th century, monks at Ely Cathedral received annual tribute from surrounding villages in eels, some 26,000 in a single year. That's not taxation. That's a lifestyle. Today, the tradition of jellied eels lingers faintly in East London, where it became a staple for working-class families well into the 20th century. Served cold in paella mash shops, often with a dash of chili vinegar, it remained a symbol of gritty resilience, even as other foods replaced it. And while the Thames no longer runs thick with silver coils, the memory clings, like the jelly. You finish your bowl and hand it back to the tavern keeper, who nods approvingly. Outside, the sun has begun to rise, casting gold across the water. Mist clings to the riverbanks. Somewhere nearby, a fisherman hauls up a trap and peers inside, hopeful. You're not sure what the next dish will be. But for now, you're full in the quietest, most unexpected way. You've eaten something ancient. You've swallowed the river. And you are, somehow, at peace. You're seated at a long oak table in a hall that smells of rushes, damp stone, and something faintly sweet. The fire in the hearth is low but steady, casting orange flickers across the worn walls. The morning is quiet. Outside, frost still clings to the windowsills. But in front of you sits something warm and curious, a bowl lined with straw, inside of which rest 6 perfect eggs. Only, they're not eggs. One is slightly too glossy. One has a hint of spice on its shell. One wobbles faintly when you shift your weight at the table. You reach for the nearest, and the shell gives under your fingers, not cracking, but yielding like wax. Confused, you slice into it with your knife. There's no yolk. No white. Just a thick, golden custard that jiggles softly on the blade, warm and fragrant with saffron and almond. It's not a mistake. You've just been served a subtlety, a medieval culinary illusion. Subtleties weren't subtle at all. They were extravagant, surprising, and sometimes absurd dishes served between courses at noble feasts. Food that didn't look like food. Dishes meant to astonish more than to nourish. Sugar castles. Meat pies shaped like swans. Jelly molded into fish that appeared to swim. A roasted chicken reconstructed with its feathers and posed mid-flight. And then, there were eggs. Not eggs from a hen, but eggs sculpted by human hands. Reimagined. Deconstructed. Rebuilt from scratch. You take a bite. It's warm and smooth, almost melting on your tongue. The texture lies somewhere between flan and butter. There's a depth of flavor, nutmeg, maybe a whisper of cinnamon, definitely saffron. The custard is folded with almond milk, giving it a faint sweetness and a silkiness that coats your mouth. It's familiar, but transformed. These weren't party tricks for children. In 14th and 15th century Europe, especially in France and Italy, subtleties like this were considered high art. To make an egg that wasn't an egg took skill, shaping the custard inside a clean shell, or molding it entirely out of almond paste, or using fish or meat to replicate the shape and texture of something utterly different. One English recipe details how to mold fish into the shape of eggs using finely pounded pike meat, herbs, and breadcrumbs, wrapped in linen and boiled, then painted with saffron to give it that sunlit yellow. You glance around the hall. This is no royal court, but a wealthy household. A feast has just passed, judging by the traces of powdered sugar on the tablecloth and the smell of roasted quince in the air. A servant brings out more eggs, placing them with exaggerated care onto a dish that looks like a nest. Some are savory, some sweet. One is clearly a meatball in disguise. Another wobbles like jelly. There's laughter around the table, not derisive, but delighted. This, too, was the point. Subtleties were meant to entertain. To show off the cook's imagination and the lord's wealth. They blurred the line between food and illusion, between nourishment and performance. And the egg was the perfect canvas, symbolic, portable, infinitely reworkable. It represented life, rebirth, mystery. To take an egg and make it not an egg was to demonstrate power over nature. In one Italian banquet, diners were presented with eggs that cracked open to reveal little birds made of sugar that flapped their wings. In Germany, preserved plums were carved into ovals and dipped in beeswax, passed off as tiny pickled eggs. In Spain, cooks blended chickpeas and honey to make a smooth paste that mimicked the texture of yolk and piped it into pastry shells. But these faux eggs weren't only about display, they had practical uses, too. During Lent, real eggs were forbidden. So cooks made Lenten eggs from fish or grains, shaped them like the real thing, and presented them as holy ingenuity. One 15th century monk praised these blessed eggs of the Lord's season, while another accused cooks of mocking God with illusions upon illusions. Historians still argue whether these dishes were considered clever or irreverent, sincere or sly. The truth, as always, likely depended on who was eating them, and how hungry they were. You lift another egg from the bowl. This one is slightly heavier. You tap it. It doesn't crack. You bite, and the shell shatters into crisp pastry. Inside is a yolk of mashed root vegetables dyed yellow with saffron and bound with cheese. Another bite reveals chopped liver and ground almonds. It's rich, earthy, and unexpectedly satisfying. Elsewhere, records tell of subtleties served in series: 12 faux eggs, each with a different filling, fruit custard, marrow, hazelnut paste, spiced pork, fig jam, and even anchovy mousse. Some were meant to amuse. Others were political. In one court, a diplomat received an egg with a small silver coin hidden inside, a symbol of alliance. In another, the yolk contained a scroll of rice paper with a message: "We are what we pretend to be." The egg became a message board. It also became a way to stretch resources. When ingredients were scarce, a skilled cook could make something rich with only a few elements. 3 egg yolks, a handful of breadcrumbs, some herbs and milk. Suddenly you had 6 eggs for the table. It was economy through illusion. Magic for the hungry. The kitchen behind you hums with activity. You hear the clatter of spoons, the splash of wine into copper pots, and the occasional hiss of sugar caramelizing on a flat stone. A young apprentice stands over a bowl, molding another batch of custard with practiced hands. Her fingers are stained gold from saffron, and there's a smile tugging at her mouth. You realize, she's enjoying the mischief of it. The artistry. The egg is her canvas. The lie is her medium. You glance down at the remains of your faux egg and wonder. How long would it have fooled you if you hadn't cut it open? Is it still food if it deceives? Or is it more? Some scholars believe the medieval obsession with illusion foods reflected deeper anxieties, about authenticity, identity, even faith. If bread could become flesh and wine become blood, what was an egg, really? A symbol? A trick? A prayer? Others argue it was just playful. A break from the monotony of stews and porridges. A moment of surprise before the next heavy roast arrived. You're not sure. But you know this: it made you pause. Made you smile. Made you remember that food, like people, can wear many faces. A final egg sits untouched on the table. It's painted with a fine gold dust, and as you pick it up, it rolls slightly in your palm, cool, fragrant, and promising. You close your eyes and bite. It tastes like cinnamon, almond, and a little something unknown. And that's what makes it perfect. You're walking beside a muddy riverbank just before dusk. The air is thick with that low, green smell of reeds and wet earth. In the distance, a heron lifts slowly into the sky. Your boots squish with every step. The marsh is alive, rippling, croaking, humming with invisible things. And then, there it is. A movement. Small, fast, and low to the ground. You kneel. And with one swift motion, a hand darts forward and closes around a squirming, cool little body. A frog. Not for study. Not for company. Not even for a spell. Tonight, it's dinner. Welcome to the marsh cuisine of the Middle Ages, where hunger and ingenuity made the swamp not just survivable, but desirable. Frogs, snails, eels, watercress, cattail roots, duck eggs, and freshwater mussels, each ingredient shaped by mud and shadow, each transformed by open flame or boiling pot into something warm, strange, and deeply satisfying. You head back to the village, where a cauldron is already bubbling and a pot of batter rests on a table. A woman dips cleaned frog legs into it, thick with ale, flour, egg, and a hint of mustard, and then lowers them into hot lard. The sizzle is immediate. Frogs weren't just food for the poor. In many medieval French and Flemish households, they were considered a delicacy, tender, quick to cook, and, when caught fresh, delightfully mild in flavor. The batter bubbles and crisps. A minute later, golden curls of meat are lifted onto a cloth-lined board. You take one, burn your fingers, and bite. It's light. Crispy. Slightly grassy. Somewhere between chicken and fish, but with a faint earthiness that lingers at the back of your throat. The ale in the batter gives it body. The mustard adds a bite. You reach for another. Frogs were only one part of a much wider, seasonal, marsh-based diet. In early spring, marsh herbs like sorrel and water mint were gathered in bundles to flavor soups and pottages. In summer, duck eggs were poached in wine and served with vinegar-soaked leeks. In autumn, river mussels were simmered in broth and flavored with sage. By winter, cattail roots were dried and pounded into flour for flatbreads. And eels, always eels. Slippery, plentiful, and near impossible to trap unless you knew exactly how. In England, peasants built wicker eel baskets that lay submerged in muddy waters overnight. In the morning, the baskets would wriggle. Eels were cleaned, chopped, and either stewed with ale and parsley or jellied for winter storage. Monasteries loved them. So did nobles. In fact, rents were often paid in eels. One 13th century document records a debt of 26,000 eels delivered to a bishop over the course of a year. Historians still debate whether that's literal or symbolic. Either way, it's a lot of slime. You sit at the fire now, where a shallow iron pan is being filled with snail skewers. The snails have been parboiled and cleaned, then brushed with garlic and fennel oil before being grilled slowly over hot coals. A boy turns the sticks carefully. Each snail puffs slightly as it cooks, becoming soft and smoky. When they're done, he lays the skewers beside the frog legs. You're invited to try one. It's not what you expect. The snail is tender, chewy, rich with garlic and the char of smoke. Paired with a slice of dense barley bread and a cup of warm ale, it suddenly makes sense. These aren't famine foods. These are marsh delicacies. The cook tells you that in some places, especially near rivers in central France, frog legs were reserved for feast days. Cooked in butter, wine, and cloves, they were served on platters carved from alder wood, garnished with violets and parsley. Children were often sent to collect them just after rain, carrying willow baskets and sloshing barefoot through the mud. In fact, many villages developed their own secret frog-catching techniques, woven nets baited with garlic or clumps of moss laced with salt. There's one recipe from a 15th century manuscript that suggests soaking frog meat in buttermilk for 2 days, then roasting it on skewers over hot ash, brushed with a glaze of honey and rosemary. Another describes baking them in pies alongside duck meat, spiced prunes, and quince. The frogs were not center stage, but they played their part. You're beginning to realize how much of medieval marsh fare was about layers. A meal wasn't just caught, it was assembled, over days or even weeks. The cattail roots were dried in summer and ground in winter. The water mint was pressed into vinegar. The snails were fed scraps of herb and oat for days before harvest. Even frogs, small as they are, were sometimes stuffed with breadcrumbs and dried fruit before being fried. One cook once joked that, a frog may be small, but its table is vast. Nearby, someone lays out a shallow dish filled with watercress, duck egg halves, frog legs, and pickled onion petals. The greens shine with oil. The egg yolks are deep orange. The frog legs sit like little commas in a paragraph of herbs. It's beautiful. Almost dainty. You blink, and remember, this was gathered, not bought. Caught, not cultivated. This is elegance by accident. Or perhaps, elegance by necessity. There's even a dessert made from the marsh, frog spawn pudding. Don't worry. It's not what it sounds like. The name comes from the look, milky barley thickened with milk, honey, and soaked chia or flaxseed, giving the surface a gelatinous, speckled sheen. Some versions even included dried elderflowers or candied rose hips for aroma. One noble lady described it in her diary as, a dish as strange as moonlight, but thrice as comforting. Some marsh foods walked a line between culinary and medicinal. Water mint was believed to ease stomach cramps. Duck fat, when rendered and preserved, was rubbed on joints to soothe aches. Frog fat, collected carefully, rendered slowly, was rumored to cure cracked skin and persistent coughs. There's no proof, of course. But in a world with little certainty, food was always part medicine, part magic, part myth. One medieval healer claimed eating frog livers during a full moon could reveal prophetic dreams. Another warned that eating marsh snails in summer would cloud the eye and excite lewdness. Whether anyone listened is unclear. But the dishes persisted. You take another bite of your ale-battered frog leg, now gone cold and slightly rubbery, but still pleasant. A reminder that time moves quickly in good company. You hear an owl begin to hoot in the distance. The marsh is settling down. And yet, everything still feels very much alive. The reeds shift. The water laps. The fire pops. Somewhere, out beyond the edge of the village, frogs are still singing. And you, belly full of things most modern mouths would fear, are oddly comforted. Because in this twilight world of damp roots and slippery legs, of battered frogs and snails on sticks, you've found something rare. A meal that tastes like mystery. You're in a dim storeroom now, stone-walled and cool, lit by a single flickering taper wedged into a split onion. Around you are shelves of jars, ceramic, glass, and horn. The air smells faintly of sourness and something nutty. There's movement outside, a distant bleat. But in here, everything is still. You reach for a pot marked with a wax seal and gently pry the lid. Inside, it's white, thick, slightly curdled, and resting under a thin film of oil. Not cow's milk. But milk nonetheless. Maybe. This, you'll come to learn, is almond milk, not a modern fad, not a vegan trend, but a medieval staple. And in many kitchens of the Middle Ages, cow's milk was far from the default. Instead, people across Europe and the wider medieval world consumed a surprising array of animal and plant milks: goats, sheep, mares, asses, almond, poppy seed, and even pine nut. Each had its own texture, purpose, season, and status. Cow's milk was familiar, but not always practical. It spoiled quickly, especially in summer. It was often reserved for cheese or butter, not drinking. And in religious seasons like Lent or Advent, when animal products were forbidden, cooks turned to white liquids that weren't technically milk, but served the same function. You dip a spoon into the almond milk. It's gritty, slightly sweet, and warm with a hint of cinnamon. Made by pounding blanched almonds with warm water or broth, then straining the mixture through cloth, it was prized for its richness and shelf life. It could be sweetened with honey, or salted and used in stews, sauces, and custards. It was even stirred into pottages to give body, or used to simulate cream in meatless dishes. In noble households, almond milk was considered elegant, appropriate for fasts and festivals alike. Some kitchens would flavor it with rosewater or orange blossom, and serve it chilled in silver jugs. It appeared in hundreds of recipes, from rice puddings to fish sauces to faux eggs. Cooks often used it as a thickener in porridge or even as a base for spiced drinks, early, soft precursors to eggnog. But almond milk wasn't the only alternative. Goat's milk was common in hilly regions and among poorer households. Easier to digest, less fatty, slightly tangier than cow's milk, it was used especially for fresh cheeses and medicinal tonics. It was believed to cool the body, ease fevers, and soothe sore throats. Shepherds often drank it warm from the source, and it was one of the few milks tolerated by those with a bilious constitution, or so the physicians wrote. Then there was mare's milk, yes, from horses. You're skeptical, understandably. But mare's milk had a place, especially in Eastern Europe and the steppe regions where horses were central to culture and cuisine. The Mongols fermented it into kumis, a mildly alcoholic, frothy drink that was both nourishing and slightly intoxicating. It was described by one 13th century traveler as sour, sparkling, like sharp wine with butter. In parts of Hungary and Poland, mare's milk was recommended for clearing the humors, and occasionally shipped dried in flake form, to be reconstituted in water like early powdered milk. Not to be outdone, ass's milk, from female donkeys, had its own niche. It was famously expensive. Roman emperors had bathed in it. In the Middle Ages, it was considered medicinal, good for the skin, restorative for the elderly, and ideal for infants weaned too soon. Monasteries sometimes kept a single donkey just for this purpose, feeding it herbs to flavor the milk. One apothecary's book notes, "The milk of the ass is warming and gentle and doth cleanse the lungs." It was even used in poultices for wounds or drunk mixed with honey for coughs. Historians still argue whether most people actually drank it, or merely wrote about drinking it, one of those medieval mysteries where practicality and fantasy blur. You notice another jar on the shelf. This one holds a translucent, slightly bluish liquid. A label written in cramped Latin suggests it's poppy milk, an infusion made from ground poppy seeds, soaked in water or wine and strained. It was used not as food, but as sleep medicine. A few spoonfuls at night. Quiet dreams by morning. Children were given it. The elderly. Occasionally, insomniac monks. Recipes vary, some include sugar, others honey, a few, dangerously, strong wine. In one Italian kitchen, a version of poppy milk was folded into bread dough for moon rolls, a supper treat meant to calm restless minds. Whether it worked or not, well, you're welcome to try. But not all milks were white. Pine nut milk, for example, was pale gold and oily. Expensive, rich, and favored in courtly recipes. It was used to thicken sauces, moisten meat pies, and create illusion dishes, like golden cheese molded from nuts and milk, dyed with saffron. It was served during Lent, but also at weddings, often flavored with cloves and dried fruit. Its texture was described in one text as, like butter that sings in the mouth. Whether it truly sang is debatable. You begin to see the ingenuity at play. When animal products were forbidden or scarce, cooks didn't despair, they improvised. Lent? No cow milk? No problem. Almonds, walnuts, pine nuts, and poppy seed could all be transformed. When goat's milk curdled, it became cheese. When ass's milk ran dry, one turned to herbal infusions with similar textures. The goal wasn't to replicate flavor exactly, but to preserve ritual, texture, and nourishment. Even butter had substitutes. In Eastern Europe, walnut oil or hemp seed oil was used. In parts of Spain, mashed figs were mixed with flour and water to form a fatty paste. In fasting times, these were folded into bread doughs or brushed over pastries to mimic richness without breaking rules. The Church, for its part, occasionally frowned on these practices, but more often than not, allowed them. After all, food was central to life, and even saints had to eat. You lift your bowl of almond milk again, now lukewarm. It's thinner than cream, but far richer than water. Somewhere between beverage and sauce. Sweetened with a bit of honey and stirred with a cinnamon stick, it begins to feel like comfort. Outside, the goats bleat softly. You imagine someone milking them now, in the cold, their hands chapped, their bucket steaming faintly. Tomorrow that milk might be butter. Or cheese. Or gone. Inside, the jars wait quietly. Almond. Goat. Ass. Mare. Poppy. Pine. Not always milk as you know it. But milk enough. You're standing near a wooden barrel. Its rim is damp, its lid slightly askew, and the scent wafting from it is alarming. Not rotten. Not quite. But sharp. Salty. Deeply sour. The kind of smell that creeps into your clothes and clings to the back of your throat. You wrinkle your nose, and then notice that no one else around you seems the least bit disturbed. In fact, they're lining up for a taste. Because tonight's dish is a prized delicacy, fermented fish. Not dried, not salted, but truly, thoroughly fermented. Welcome to one of the most misunderstood corners of medieval cuisine, a world of pickled eels, brined lampreys, sour trout paste, and fish sauces strong enough to carry across a castle courtyard. In an era without refrigeration, fermentation wasn't just tradition, it was survival. Salt was precious. Smoke required space. But fermentation? That needed only a barrel, time, and trust. In Northern Europe especially, Scandinavia, the Baltic coast, and coastal Britain. Fish were caught in vast quantities during the spring and autumn runs, then packed in barrels with salt and herbs and left to change. Over days, then weeks, then months, flesh broke down. Enzymes did their quiet work. And when the barrel was opened, the result was soft, pungent, tangy, and deeply polarizing. You're handed a sliver of herring from one such barrel. It glistens faintly, the color of damp pewter, and gives easily to the touch. You place it on a piece of black rye bread, just as instructed, and take a careful bite. It's not what you expect. Yes, it's strong. But also, lemony. A bit buttery. Slightly fizzy at the edges, like it's still alive. It pairs surprisingly well with the bread, whose bitterness tones down the sharpness. Someone offers you a raw onion slice to go with it. Another person drizzles honey over their portion. Everyone, it seems, has a ritual. A method. A way of making the strange more comforting. Fermented fish took many forms. In Sweden, there was surströmming, Baltic herring fermented in weak brine until it bloomed with lactic acid. In parts of Germany, eels were packed with mustard seeds, vinegar, and dill. In medieval Russia, fishermen stored fermented pike in birch bark buckets buried underground. English households brewed garum-like sauces, called liquamen, made from rotted fish scraps and herbs, aged under stone weights. These sauces were poured into stews, spread on bread, or mixed with oil and vinegar to create pungent dips. And then there was lutefisk. Dried cod soaked in lye until it became gelatinous, translucent, and, depending on whom you ask, either exquisite or inedible. The process was long, involving soaking, rinsing, neutralizing, and cooking, but the result was a protein-packed dish perfect for long winters. It slid on the plate, shimmered in the firelight, and squeaked slightly against the teeth. Historians still argue whether lutefisk was a peasant fallback or a festive highlight. Likely both. Beyond fish, fermentation was used on nearly anything that needed preserving. Cabbages, turnips, onions, garlic, and even wild herbs were pickled in brines of salt and wine. One recipe from 14th century France outlines a root cellar pickle made with horseradish, parsnip, and wormwood leaves. Another from Bohemia describes apple peels steeped in vinegar, left to sour into a kind of tangy relish. Eggs, too, were pickled, not just hard-boiled, but soft-cooked, pierced, and then stored in pots of spiced wine or ale vinegar. They emerged brown-stained, wobbly, and mouth-puckering. One nobleman swore they restored his appetite. His wife, however, wrote that they tasted like the dreams of vinegar. You're brought a small wooden dish. On it are samples, pickled lamprey, dark and shiny, like licorice, fermented trout paste, spread thin on barley crackers, and something labeled simply as sea custard. You try the lamprey first. It's chewy. Oily. The vinegar cuts through the fattiness. You're reminded faintly of smoked mackerel, but with a darker undertone. The trout paste, on the other hand, is almost spreadable, like a fish butter, sharp with salt and garlic. Sea custard, however, lives up to its name in texture, creamy and smooth, but not in sweetness. It's made from minced haddock, almond milk, and fermented apple peel, set with egg and served cold. Some of these dishes were born of desperation, leftovers reimagined, scraps preserved. But others were calculated, deliberate. A good pickler was valued in any household. A master of balance. Too little salt, and the food spoiled. Too much, and it became inedible. Herbs had to be chosen wisely. rosemary to freshen, mustard seed to bite, dill to soothe, cloves to disguise, bay leaf to preserve. Pickling also had symbolic meaning. In monastic communities, sour foods were thought to tame earthly desires. In royal courts, pickled delicacies were considered signs of worldliness. To serve a fermented sturgeon from the Black Sea or a spiced eel from the Thames was to display reach, influence, and refined taste, even if your guests struggled to keep their expressions polite. In fact, one chronicler recounts a banquet where the Queen of Navarre sampled a spiced vinegar eel and immediately demanded a second. Whether out of genuine affection or theatrical duty, no one could say. Cultural context mattered. In Scandinavia, sourness was celebrated. In southern Europe, it was often masked with honey or saffron. In Islamic Andalusia, pickled lemon and fish were layered in stews to create rich contrasts. In Japan, fermented fish pastes, known as shiakra, paralleled garum in both function and infamy. Though outside medieval Europe's borders, their existence reminds us, this was not a European peculiarity. Fermented, pickled, and preserved foods are ancient, universal, and deeply human. You take another bite of the trout paste and find yourself warming to the flavor. The first taste was shocking. The second, curious. Now, it's almost addictive. Salty, sour, and oddly creamy. You spread more on your cracker. A monk nearby offers you a sip of wine, mulled with cloves and fennel, to cleanse the soul. Food, in this moment, feels ceremonial. Even celebratory. You hear stories, how fermented fish was served to knights before battle, to steel the nerves, how sour cabbages lined the trenches of castles under siege. How vinegar eggs were exchanged as tokens of resilience during long winters. How mothers would pickle garlic and keep it for their daughters' dowries. Fermentation became legacy. One last sample remains, a pickled radish, white and sharp, stored in honey brine with pepper and thyme. It crunches like fire, floods your mouth, then fades into sweetness. You laugh, half in surprise, half in relief. Around you, the barrels sit quietly, still fermenting. Still changing. Still transforming the familiar into the unfamiliar. The safe into the strange. The forgotten into the unforgettable. And as you breathe in the sour salt air and feel your body settle from the inside out, you begin to understand the deeper magic of it all. Fermented food is time made edible. A slow patience. A quiet confidence. A reminder that flavor isn't always instant. That some of the best things take months in the dark, bubbling, unknown. The hall is quiet now, not solemn, but anticipatory. Somewhere in the distance, a musician plucks a slow note on a rebec, soft and lonesome. You sit back slightly in your seat, belly warm with stews and spiced lampreys, when a hush ripples through the room. The servants are bringing in the final course, and there's something different about the way they move. Lighter. Almost theatrical. Plates are hidden under domes of pastry. Trays wobble with delicately stacked shapes. The air smells of sugar, but also roasted onions and vinegar. Nothing makes sense, and that's the point. Because this isn't dessert. It's not even a real course, not in the nutritional sense. This is a performance. A joke wrapped in jelly. A final offering from the medieval kitchen, not to nourish, but to delight. The first dish placed in front of you looks like a roasted dove. Feathered. Golden. Slightly slumped to one side. But when your knife touches the skin, it slides through marzipan. Beneath the almond shell. Saffron rice. Inside that, minced apple, pork fat, and a little sage. The cook has recreated a bird using no bird at all. You laugh, gently. It's disorienting, but clever. And it's not the only surprise. Beside you, someone receives what appears to be a boiled egg in its shell. They tap it against the table to crack it open, only to find the shell is made of painted sugar, and the yolk is thick, orange apricot jam. Another guest lifts a delicate pastry swan off their plate. It flaps. No, really, tiny springs let the wings flutter. Someone down the table is sipping wine out of a hollowed turnip carved into the shape of a sleeping cat. None of it is strictly necessary. That's exactly why it matters. These playful dishes, known broadly as entremets, were a fixture of noble feasts, especially in 14th and 15th century France and England. Originally, the word meant, between servings, a small musical or theatrical performance placed between courses to entertain diners. But over time, that idea fused with food itself. The dish became the entertainment. Entire roast boars were served with their mouths stuffed with songbirds. Pies released live doves. Puddings shaped like saints melted gently under candlelight. Even jelly was used to tell stories, layered, multicolored cubes carved to look like stained glass windows. These weren't gimmicks for children, they were social currency. A well-executed illusion dish signaled wealth, culinary knowledge, and a willingness to indulge in whimsy. Some were straightforwardly humorous, meat pies shaped like monks, custards disguised as cabbages. Others carried hidden messages. A red and white tower of meringue might represent a local rivalry. A jelly dragon slayed by a fig-shaped knight might nod to a recent political truce. The food told stories, for those clever enough to taste them. Historians still argue whether these dishes were eaten in full or simply admired. Some recipes seem more decorative than digestible. Others, like the sweetened porridge molded into a goose and toasted until it browned, were clearly meant to be consumed, once the laughter died down. You're brought another dish now, a bowl of stones. Each is round, smooth, slightly dusty, looking every bit like pebbles from a riverbed. But when you bite into one, it gives way, candied walnut, coated in barley syrup and rolled in charcoal powder. The illusion holds even in the mouth. Another dish arrives, mice, made of sugared figs with almond slivers for ears and cinnamon tails. They're nestled into a bed of sugared hay. Around you, guests are talking again, softer this time. The heavy roasts are behind them. The wine is mellowing. People laugh, lean in, share a mouse or a pebble. In these final moments of the feast, something shifts. Formality fades. Play returns. And perhaps that, more than anything, was the true purpose of the entremet. Because in a world thick with plague, war, famine, and superstition, to choose to play with food was an act of defiance. Of celebration. Of survival. To take a root vegetable and make it into a duck. To shape breadcrumbs into a moon and float it in soup. That was magic. That was art. That was joy. Not all entremets were edible. Some were mechanical. One record from the court of Burgundy describes a pie that played music when sliced. Another speaks of a roast peacock redressed in its own feathers, its beak holding a saffron candle that lit the room as it was carried in. Some dishes arrived on moving platforms pulled by costumed pages. Others were built to collapse in dramatic, syrupy ruins, just for the gasp it provoked. And now, your final dish. It's a custard, cold and gently wobbling, shaped like a castle keep. The crenellations are made from jelly. A thin sugar drawbridge lies across a moat of almond milk. You lift your spoon, and the drawbridge cracks. The whole thing quivers and folds, releasing sugared rose petals and warm vanilla cream. It was never meant to last. Just to delight. You take your time eating it. The cream is cool. The custard fragrant. The petals, almost chewy. Every bite feels like a secret shared. As you finish, the hall begins to dim. Candles flicker lower. A window is opened somewhere, and the cool night air seeps in. You hear the last few spoons clink. A stifled yawn. A stretch. Someone sighs, deeply. The feast is done. The games have ended. And in your belly, not just food, but wonder. Now the banquet is over, but its echoes remain. You feel them not in your stomach, but in your chest, in that soft, floating part of you that remembers how to marvel. You lean back. The flickering candlelight is quieter now. The scents have thinned. The fire has sunk to coals. A server passes with a basin of rosewater, and you dip your fingertips in, feeling the warmth bloom between each knuckle. Somewhere beyond the walls, a nightingale calls. And here, in this suspended moment, everything is soft. Think of what you've eaten. A pear that wasn't a pear. A castle made of milk. A pie that sang. You may not remember the recipes. But you'll remember the feeling of being surprised. Of laughing, gently, with strangers in the dark. Of being reminded that even in times of shadow, there was room for light. For play. For pleasure. You feel your breath slow now. Your muscles loosen. The food, the noise, the flicker of gold and spice, all of it is fading, like the aftertaste of something sweet. Your hands fall still. Your eyes grow heavy. Somewhere, in a kitchen forgotten by time, a cook is shaping another illusion, a rabbit made of marzipan, a fish carved from turnip, a star molded from quince. Because tomorrow, someone else will need to laugh. But not tonight. Tonight, the banquet ends with silence. A deep, velvety silence that wraps around you like wool. That says, it's time. No more dishes. No more riddles. Just this, the last candle. The last breath. The last soft note of music in the next room. And the gentle letting go. Sleep now. Dream of castles made of jelly.